Welcome to Inside the Vatican with America Media. Each week, veteran Vatican reporter Gerry O'Connell and I take you behind the headlines for an intergenerational conversation about the biggest stories out of the Vatican. On Monday, Pope Francis returned from his trip to Mongolia. He was the first pope to ever visit the country, which is sandwiched between Russia and China. Gerry traveled with the Pope. We'll give you the story from the ground. And on the plane ride home, the Pope discussed some comments he made about his critics in the United States. I'm Colleen Deli. This is Inside the Vatican. Good morning from New Orleans, Gerry, and happy 6th season of Inside the Vatican.
Good morning from Rome, Colleen. It's afternoon here, and it's sunny.
Yeah, it is the same here, and I'm sweating already because I have to turn off my air conditioning for the podcast recording. Gerry, we are diving right into a very busy fall now that it's September. We're back from break. We've got the Synod coming up in October. We've got the Pope going to Marseille. The Pope also announced that he is writing a part 2 to Laudato Si that's coming out on October 4th. So we've got a lot going on. But first, let's get into the Pope's visit to Mongolia that you just returned from. Pope Francis visited Mongolia from August 31st through September 4th. And as we talked about in our deep dive episode leading up to this visit, this is a country with very few Catholics. So half the population is Buddhist and another 40% don't follow any religion. So Gerry, I just want you to paint the picture for me. What was the Pope's reception like here from both Catholics and non-Catholics?
Well, first of all, I think the comment the Pope made at the audience this Wednesday morning, I have been to the heart of Asia and it has done me good.
Mm-hmm.
I think that sums really up what Francis felt, and I think what most people felt.
Tell me more.
He went to a country that no Pope had ever been to before, although the Vatican has had relations with Mongolia for 777 years.
Mm-hmm.
So almost 8 centuries.
Right, and these were some of the early missionaries and letters from popes that we talked about in the deep dive.
Exactly. And when he went there, really from his arrival at the airport to his departure, arrival on the morning of the 1st of September, departure on the 4th of September, they treated him like a king, like an emperor, the authorities. And all the way in from the airport and round the city, you saw flags of the Vatican, the yellow and white flags of the Vatican, and the Mongolian flag together. This really showed up. This is a country that, as you said, infinite. In all Christians, I think 60,000 in the whole country. The population is 3.4 million. So it's a small population in an enormous country. Mountains, the Gobi Desert takes up, I think, 1/3 of it.
Yeah, it's the most sparsely populated country in the world.
Absolutely. And it has no exit to the sea. 97% of its exports go to China. It depends on Russia, the other big neighbor, for energy and for heavy vehicles, etc. And they're trying to reach beyond the kind of the embrace of these two giants. They're trying to reach out to the rest of the world, looking for the third neighbor.
Right. This has been a key expression in kind of Mongolian foreign policy for a long time, looking for a third neighbor. Some people say that it's Korea. Some people say that it's, other countries that they've been reaching out to. So what was the importance of that? Is the idea that the Vatican is a third neighbor now?
Well, it's very interesting because they invited the Pope.
Yes. Is that unusual?
Obviously, the Pope can't go to a country without an invitation, but they were keen to have him come. And I remember way back in John Paul II's time, John Paul II was in 2003 hoping to go to Mongolia, and the Mongolians wanted him.
Right.
They recognize, especially Pope Francis, they recognize him as a big figure on the world stage. They respect him. And in the speech, when the president welcomed him, he said, there's so much in common between what your positions on climate change, on reaching out to people, etc., that also we share.
Hmm.
They have abandoned nuclear power. They have abandoned the death penalty. They have much in common with the Pope. And they see him especially as reaching out to all the other religions, which has been the long tradition of Mongolia itself.
So
So
they have these shared values, and you kind of laid out the background of them looking for a third neighbor. So what did it mean for them for the Pope to come?
it gave them enormous visibility on the world stage because the Pope arrives with an international press. There were 66 journalists from many countries, international media. I mean, you get more publicity for
Hmm.
your tourism from a papal visit than you would from your Ministry of Tourism spending a lot of money on tourism. But
Yeah, I remember we talked about this when the Pope went to Iraq. It was like all the visibility around the trip was going to kind of help, rehabilitate the image of Iraq as a place that one can visit rather than just like a place of war and violence. So I guess it was a similar thing for Mongolia where this raised their profile on the world stage.
it raised their profile. And then it's a peaceful country. It's a
Hmm.
peaceful country. It's working for peace initiatives on the international field. Internally, there's peace. And so oh, there's a lot of poverty as well. About one third of the people are living in poverty. But
Hmm.
Colleen, I was really struck. Here's a tiny, and the Pope said it in the audience this morning. He said, people ask, why is the Pope going to that country? There's so few Catholics. And he said, but this is the very reason. And
Hmm.
he praised how 30 years ago, there wasn't a Catholic community in this country. And then the zeal, the enthusiasm of missionaries from the Philippines, from other countries, and there are many missionaries from many countries there now, uh, they started a community, not proselytizing, but started just doing charitable initiatives around and connecting with the people.
And a
And
real key to that is that they don't expect people to convert to Catholicism in order to receive that education, those social services, and so on. Whereas some of the Mongolians that I've been chatting with leading up to this trip were saying, we're skeptical of the other churches because they do require you to join their church in order to receive those services. But the Catholic Church doesn't.
Pope Francis was very clear about this. We
Hmm.
do charitable initiatives and charitable work not to get you in, but
Yeah.
that is our way of being, our way of serving God and serving others. And then he cited Benedict the 16th, who says, people come to the church by attraction. They're
Hmm.
attracted. And I saw this actually, Colleen, in the square on the first big event when they gave him this wonderful, really pageant welcome where you had all the different divisions of the armed forces marching, and then on horseback, these
Hmm.
uh, soldiers in ancient kind of armored gear.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It really was so impressive. And there was a man at the back of the square I talked to, 65, 70-year-old man, and I said to him with the help of an interpreter, you know, uh, why are you here? Are you Catholic? No, 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 I'm Buddhist. Why are you here? He said, well, last night I was watching the television. I saw the Pope. I didn't even know who he was before, but I
Hmm.
saw him and I watched and I thought, this man is interesting. I'm going to come and see him for myself. And then I was struck by what a sister of Mother Teresa's sisters,
Hmm. The Missionaries
uh,
of Charity.
Sister Merrill, I think was her name, if I recall correctly. She had been 17 years in the country, working with the poorest of the poor. And she said, I said, what do you think of the Pope's visit? She said, we were here by ourselves. We're a small community. She
Hmm.
said, the church community is small. We thought nobody was noticing us. And she
Hmm.
said, here God has visited his people.
Hmm.
That's how they saw the visit. And I was very struck like that. She said, now we know we are not alone. The Pope coming, God has come in the person of the Pope to visit his people. I found this very striking indeed. And then I met a second sister who had spent 20 years, I think, there from
Wow.
Argentina, a sister called Saint Sister Sandra. And
Okay.
I said saint by mistake, but really these people are saints in my estimation. And she said, I said, what was it like when you came here 20 years ago? She came in 2003, 2004. She said, well, it's like living the experience of the Acts of the Apostles in
Hmm.
the early Christian church. She says, that's what I felt then, and it's probably the same today. So these two sisters who have one 17, the other 20 years, it really struck me how the, the faith and the real joy that they exude.
Hmm.
And the
And the
Pope,
Pope's key message throughout a lot of his talks in Mongolia was stressing this idea of enculturation, missionaries, becoming part of the Mongolian people, learning the language, embracing the culture, living among the people, rather than trying to like impose a culture and a religion. Instead, he really stresses that they need to be living amongst the people and then attract people by living joyfully, and then people become curious about the source of their joy, and they realize, oh, this joy comes from God. Maybe I want to look more into this religion that these people have, even if I perceive it as something being outside. And that was his message also when he was dedicating the House of Mercy, which was this charitable center he dedicated on the last day that he was there, where he really stressed, Christianity in Mongolia is not something foreign, it's not something new, it's something that can grow out from the culture, and it's that enculturation rather than like proselytism or imposition that is the mark of missionary work today.
yes,
Um,
and the striking thing, Colleen, was the fact that when it came to building a church
mhm,
in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city where half the population now live,
mhm,
they didn't build a church that looks like the churches we see in the West.
mhm,
They adopted the tent-like abode residence of the people, nomadic people, for centuries.
mhm,
And so the church is in the shape of what they call a ger,
mhm,
G-E-R. It's a tent-like shape where the door is to the south and where there's only one window where that's in the center and where the light comes through. And I think that really is a very powerful example of how they have chosen to identify with the culture, with the way people live in that country. Uh, in the past, if you look in India, for example, they built a big church, but it was more Roman-like church.
mhm,
This is totally Mongolian.
mhm.
Now, I saw
And
the
it's different from other Christian churches that you see in Ulaanbaatar too, right?
well, there's the only other Christian church that really is there is the Russian Orthodox, and you
Mhm.
see the typical Russian Orthodox church, which has like you would say these like onion
Onion-shaped
shapes on the
domes,
domes,
yeah.
golden,
Mhm,
and they have kept the traditional one. And
mhm,
I was particularly struck by the contrast between these two.
mhm.
So the language for the missionaries is very difficult, the sisters
Yeah.
told me. Secondly, it has been very difficult for them, the Mother Teresa's sister told me. When we get a new sister in, we have to employ 4 local Mongolian people.
Oh, why? What for?
This is the government, and the government
Hmm.
checks when they have people come into their shelters.
Mhm.
And they had a shelter for young women who were being in human trafficking, and uh, the government would have people come in, the police would come in, and they check, are they kind of forcing you to become Christian, to become Catholic?
Ah.
And they said, it was so clear that we're not doing it. And
Mhm.
they've never had problems with this because they've never been doing it. But there was, I think, after the Pope's visit, things will change for the church because the government so respects him.
Mhm.
Remember that on throughout this whole visit, all the four major events that the Pope took part in, the five, really, the opening of the House of Mercy was the last one.
Mm-hmm.
It was on national television.
Right.
Never
Every
has the
single event.
church in the history of this country had such visibility. And it's
Mm-hmm.
because of the Pope.
Gerry, I want to ask you about this comment that you made a minute ago about that you think it'll have a lasting effect on the church in Mongolia. What does that look like?
Well, I asked some of the people there in the church
Mm-hmm.
there what it means. They said it doesn't necessarily mean we'll have extraordinary numbers,
Mm-hmm.
but they will see that we're giving a witness to our God. And there is this, I think it's in the DNA of the people there, this sense of a transcendent,
Mm-hmm.
of there's something beyond human life.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
see,
Even though most of the population, or a large part of the population, is a-religious, I think there definitely is like a deep spirituality
there's a
in
deep
Mongolia.
spirituality. And in fact, in the meeting that the Pope had with the representatives of the different religions, there was a group that I'd never heard of in my life, Dreamers of Heaven. Dreamers of Heaven. But the reality, you see this blue sky, clear blue sky, and you see this vast expanse of steppes, prairies, forests, and desert. And in a sense, in this kind of situation, you're almost carried to look beyond the human reality where you're so small in such a
Mm-hmm.
big territory. And
It's
the
beautiful.
Pope picked this up,
Mm-hmm.
and it resonated with him. And I think America will publish the Pope's talk this morning
Mm-hmm.
in the
Yeah, we
audience
are.
Wednesday. I think that should go on the show notes because it's really, it's very beautiful.
It is. Yeah, there was a quote in there I really liked about how people always pay attention to the tree that makes a lot of noise when it falls, but they don't pay attention to the growth because growth is silent.
Yes. And
Gerry, one last question for you on this before we move on to talking about the Papal Plane press conference. But the big thing that was kind of dominating my mind as I was thinking about this trip to Mongolia was the fact that the country is completely surrounded by Russia to the north and China to the south. Our sources for the deep dive who I talked to didn't expect much of the attention from the Pope to be on China and Russia during the trip. I wanted to ask for you, did that ring true? Were they kind of out of focus, or were there some nods, some acknowledgments of Mongolia's very powerful neighbors?
China was the elephant in the room, if you want to say.
Tell me more.
It was really a presence from start to finish, because just before we went there, I published this article. China prohibited the bishops and the faithful from going to join the Pope's to join the Pope in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city.
I believe you broke that story.
Yes, I broke that story, but I have since got much more detail on this, which I haven't written up. But I know, for example, from one place, 2,000 people were going to come. In the end,
Wow.
20 came.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
they came,
20 very brave people.
very courageous people. One of the um, religious leaders from Asia said to me, I don't name for security reasons,
Mm-hmm.
he said, these are courageous people, and the
Mm-hmm.
media should respect them because they covered their face. They didn't want to be seen. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to be not seen, but identified, because they wanted to be seen, because they had
Right.
little red
Chinese
flag
flags.
of China flags, and many of them the rosary in the other hand.
Mm-hmm.
And I was surprised, because I happened to meet a lot of them
Mm-hmm.
later. I was surprised how many young people were there.
Mm.
It's reckoned, we're talking about small numbers, it's reckoned there was between one and more than 100 came defying the wrath of Beijing.
Mm-hmm. And that is, I mean, that's a fair share of the crowd. At the largest event, there were 2,000 people. Is kind of the
Yeah,
scale that we're talking about.
yes. I'd say maybe we're talking about maybe 150, but certainly more than 100. They came in 5
Mm-hmm.
groups from the mainland, and uh, these people really have courage.
I mean,
And
Gerry, just for for people who might not understand, and also for myself, what possible consequences do these people face?
well, if you're identified, and China now has technology that can track you very easily, identify you very easily,
Mm-hmm.
you would have problems with work. You would have, when they're young people, you'd have problems going to university, getting a job,
Mm-hmm.
housing, uh, and you may be taken away for re education courses, and we might call it detention.
Mm-hmm.
They call it re education. So there are many. We will have to see what is the consequence. But
Mm-hmm.
I was also struck in this context, Colleen, and I wrote it, that I talked to some of them. They didn't want to talk first, and I talked to some.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them said to me, I said, "You've come here. Why?" I said, "You know, the Pope would like to go to your homeland, to China." They said, "Yes, we come to show we love him.
Mm-hmm.
He can't come to see us. We come to see him." I mean, you're talking about, and I don't think it's too far to say, almost the faith of martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
Is they're putting their life on, their future on the line, and this is inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
I think, they talk about the China having good relations with the Vatican. On Monday, the China says, yes, we've got very, the Pope had said they're very respectful relations. China says, yes, we're
Mm-hmm.
doing this. But
The
deep
Pope sent a
down,
very cordial message when he flew over Chinese airspace.
yes, that was expected because he
Mm-hmm.
does it over every country. But he said, I have great respect for the Chinese people, etc. But
And Gerry, why this clampdown from China right before the visit?
that is a very good question. The
Do you
the
have an
the
answer?
I have talked to various people. I was told way back by a very old Chinese Jesuit who's now dead.
Mm-hmm.
He said China fears 2 things: war and religion.
Mm-hmm. I've
I
also
think
heard it
there's
phrased as they want to have religion under their control.
they want not just religion; they want everything under the
Everything,
control
yes.
of the party,
Mm-hmm.
everything, and freedom. They say, in the statement, they say we have religious freedom in the country. Well, it depends how you define freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And you can pray, but if you have children and you take, like you have a young child now, and you take it to church, that's a problem for the child's future, and it's a problem for
Mm-hmm.
you. In many places, not every place in China, but there is a kind of regulations governing that. So
All right.
we saw 2 things in here, Colin. I sum it up. We
Mm-hmm.
saw what the sister called was a church like the Acts of the Apostles, a
Mm-hmm.
church where they felt God has visited us in the visit of the Pope, and a church where there are very courageous people willing to follow the Pope, but who are out in China.
So, on the plane back from Mongolia, Pope Francis held a press conference and you got to ask him a question. And then on the plane there, at the beginning of the trip, he also met with journalists individually and made some comments. We're going to talk about all of that now. First off, the story that got the most attention here in the US is that Pope Francis was asked about his critics in the United States. He was asked specifically about these comments he made about his critics to a group of Jesuits in Portugal during World Youth Day. One of the Jesuits who had lived in the US asked the Pope about how some Americans, including priests and bishops, are very strongly critical of the Pope. And Pope Francis responded by saying that being backward looking, in quotes, he uses this word indietrismo, being backward looking, is, quote, useless, and that doctrine develops over time. So these people tend to be very afraid that the Pope is changing doctrine. He also said that when people get into a kind of backward looking mentality, they lose sight of what tradition actually is and turn to ideologies instead. And this obviously upset many of his critics in the US. There have been a number of pieces published in more conservative journals about them. He was also asked about a book that Cardinal Raymond Burke, one of his most vocal critics, endorsed. This book calls the October Synod on Synodality a Pandora's box that will unleash calamity in the church. It seems to me like Pope Francis is speaking out more vocally than he ever has before against his critics. I was wondering, do you agree with that impression? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, I think Francis has had a lot of patience with critics over the years. I mean, I think back to John Paul II, for example, when he went to Nicaragua and he waved his finger at Ernesto Cardenal, one of the
Right, very
priests who
famous
was in the
image.
government. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this was very early on in the papacy, and it went right through Latin America as a very strong admonition to liberation theology.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so Francis has tended to either remain silent, ignore, less commonly to respond. He's come out more strongly recently, but if you look at the United States, there have been some bishops who really you wonder if they're in communion with the Pope at this point, with the
Mm-hmm.
statements they make when he's accused of being more or less heretic or leading the church down the wrong way. And they've failed to understand that, he was elected in a conclave with cardinals of different persuasions under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. That's what we believe, that the leader is chosen. And we
Mm-hmm.
see, and, I think sometimes Francis, we are obviously traveling with him, we see how he's greatly respected. I remember on this program in the past saying, when he went to Democratic Republic of the Congo, they said, "Thank God we have a pope."
Mm-hmm.
And here, the people in Mongolia, this nun who says, God has visited his people. I feel sometimes that some of the critics are so detached from reality. Francis always says reality is greater than ideas. And in fact, this is true. We see it. And I think that his take on the critics is they're living in a small world.
Mm.
Uh,
I
It,
think part of it is you mentioned this central idea of Pope Francis' entire papacy, which is reality is greater than ideas. This is a thing we've heard from him over and over again, and he definitely would say like being grounded in reality is much more important than being driven by an ideology, like the most extreme of ideas. But I think that some of his critics would counter that they're not clear on what the reality is when it comes to the synod in the fall. Pope Francis talked about this nun who he spoke to on the phone who said she was afraid that the synod would change doctrine. You have this book endorsed by Cardinal Burke saying that the synod is a Pandora's box, and it's difficult sometimes to counter those messages because we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the synod because so much of it is open ended. So I just wanted to raise that. I think that part of it is that the reality is not totally clear right now.
well, the reality is that he goes to a foreign country where there is practically so few Christians, and he's greatly respected because he reaches out to people.
Mm,
He's not excluding; he's including people. And remember what he said at the World Youth Day in Lisbon, that the church is for all, todos, 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 for
hmm
all, for all, for all. And some people do not like this openness, this
hmm
embrace of the whole world, and they prefer a very small, clean, clear, pure in inverted commas community to this rather uncertain or wide ranging community that Francis is talking about. But
hmm
it is this openness that is really opening new doors for the preaching of Christ
hmm
in Asia and in Africa. And it's not coming in and with a narrow message kind of this category is excluded, that category is excluded, that one is excluded. Francis says the church is open. Jesus says, bring them all in. And then each one finds his own way. This is difficult for those who have rather closed minds, who rather feel that, you know, the doctrine is like a closed box already decided. The shape of the church is already decided. It's difficult for people with that kind of thinking where everything has to be black and white. Francis says there are so many shades of gray in the world. And so many of his critics are people who exclude the shades of gray.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember this, I feel like, is the central thing with when people got upset about his footnote in Amoris Laetitia about divorced and remarried Catholics being able to receive communion again in some cases, where people were like, no, we have a rule, we have a set practice, which is that these people can't receive communion. And the Pope is saying, well, we have a rule that's based on this ideal that's laid out, but we have all these cases that don't match up to the ideal, and we have to be able to discern in those cases. And that makes people uncomfortable because it's not a set rule book.
But
Gerry,
I find this so distant from the reality of a world where so many do not believe in God, and Francis is trying to reach them and lead them to God. And also, they forget that God is at work in history, in the lives of people, in ways that we do not see now, and maybe not even see in this life. And this kind of blinkered vision of the human reality is what Francis comes out strongly against. He says God is at work in human history. And really, look at this sister who says, in the Pope's visit, God has come and visited his people. I wondered, would his critics say that? I think there's a lot that they should. I wish some of their critics got on the papal plane and had one visit to one of these countries. They may come to a different way of looking at the Pope.
All right, Gerry, speaking of papal visits, your question to the Pope on the return flight was about whether he would visit Vietnam. I was wondering if you could give us some background. Why did you ask that?
Well, to be honest, Colleen, I had originally thought of asking a question on China, but since the person in front of me asked the question on China, I asked it on Vietnam for several reasons.
Okay.
One was because there's a very strong Catholic community in Vietnam. I have known a lot of them. I've seen a lot of them in the trips he goes to. And in this trip in Mongolia, there was a whole group who were doing dancing for him. They were all dressed
From
in
Vietnam?
purple. From Vietnam. There were a lot of people from Vietnam. A lot. I mean, we're talking maybe 100, 200.
Yeah, right.
There were some priests from Vietnam whom I met. And they everywhere, I'm several countries in Asia now, I've spoken to people from Vietnam, and they all say, we want the Pope to come to us. Now the government has opened up, and they have given the Pope what China is not giving it. They have given the Pope, the Vatican, the possibility of having a resident representative living in Hanoi.
Is this like
That
a
can
nuncio?
go, well, not yet a nuncio. A nuncio would be with diplomatic relations, but I think we're on the doorstep of diplomatic relations with Vietnam. The president came and the Pope said we talked freely. And he said, I've seen over these years, and he's met several of them now from Vietnam over these years at the government level who've come to him, and also the bishops, he has met them. He said, I see that there are problems, but they are able to resolve the problems and move forward. And he said their culture is an open culture. And he said, so I asked him, do you see yourself going there? And he said, if I don't go, John the 24th will go. That's a future Pope. He said, because they merit a visit, because they really, he said, I am certain that they will get a papal visit. And then he said, what I didn't put in my written text, he said, we'll see. Francis, and that we'll see is very interesting. We'll see, in other words, let's see what happens. He doesn't exclude it.
Mm-hmm.
But
He also said that trips have gotten a little bit more difficult for him.
yeah, that is stating the obvious. That
Mm-hmm.
he said, when I started, it was much easier. Now it's more difficult, also because of walking. He has to be in a wheelchair. He's got to be taken down from the plane.
Well, and the reason I ask about that is it makes me wonder kind of what his criteria are for deciding what trips he's going to make. What's worth the effort?
Well, the decision was, first of all, for not go to the big countries where he would get hailed by and large. He hasn't been to Germany, he hasn't been to France, he hasn't been to
Mm-hmm.
Spain, he hasn't been to England. He did
He's
go to
going
the
to France
United
this
States.
month, but he says this strange thing when he talks about it. He says, I'm going to Marseille, not to France.
Yes, he's going to meet the bishops of the Mediterranean bases who have to
Mm-hmm.
deal with migrants and who have other problems,
Mm-hmm.
so trafficking and this kind of question. So it's specific. It could have. It previously it was the meeting was in Italy. This time it's in maybe some years it will be in somewhere else. But
Mm-hmm.
he's very clear that he wants to go to the peripheries, to the countries which are neglected, which are overlooked, and to help the small Catholic communities which are growing.
Mm-hmm.
And Vietnam fits into this pattern. So my question was very an informed question, if you wish.
Mm-hmm.
And I do hope, and I am convinced that if he has the possibility, he will go.
Mm-hmm. Gerry, I would expect nothing less than an informed question from you. All right, so the Pope talked about a lot of other things on the papal flight that we weren't able to cover here. There's also a number of other stories. We're trying something new this season where we're going to include a little paragraph of analysis on each of those stories that we didn't get to on our show page. So you can click the link in our show notes and go read a couple sentences about each of those. This week, the stories are going to be that part 2 of Laudato Si that Pope Francis said he was writing. We'll talk about what we know about that. We're going to talk about how Pope Francis was meeting Archbishop Shevchuk, who is the major archbishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church today, September 6th, when we're recording. He and the Pope have disagreed in the past about how the Pope approaches the Russia-Ukraine war, so we'll include a little analysis of that. Also, on the papal plane, the Pope was asked to clarify some comments he made to young people about Russia, young people in Russia. He said they should be proud of their heritage, and this was construed by some people as meaning, is he supporting the justification that Putin has given for the war to protect Russia? And so he clarified that that was not what he meant. He meant that they should try to safeguard the positive parts of Russian culture, but not obviously the imperialistic parts. And finally, there's a story coming out this week about religious communities that sheltered Jews during World War II. We'll have more coverage of that coming out later this week, and you can also read about that in the show notes because it will be out by the time you hear this podcast. All right, Gerry, that is everything for this week. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be back with you for our 6th season, if you can believe it. And yeah, I'll chat with you next week.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to your visit to Rome, Colleen.
I am too.
You were here when we were starting way back in 2000. You were here
19,
in 2019.
I was there last.
February
yeah.
2000. And I'm looking very much forward to your visit. And we'll be doing some shows from here with the help of Maggie and Kevin and whoever else is in the team.
Yep. Yeah, I'll be there for 2 weeks during the Synod, and it'll be really exciting to cover that live with you.
We can assure our listeners that there's no lack of information coming up.
Oh my goodness. I have no idea how we're covering it all.